Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Along Come Norwich for episode 2 of City Till We Die. You join myself, Ben Ambrose, and George Wilson for an episode of the podcast where there might just be a little dash of optimism, but there shall be plenty of criticism and doubting and all these wonderful things we love to do as Norwich City fans. I'd like to firstly say thank you to everyone who listened to the podcast and watched it across YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those things. For those who don't know who are watching, we're on the podcast platforms, vice versa. For those who are listening, we're also on YouTube, should you decide you would prefer to watch our lovely faces talk about Norwich City. George, first and foremost, my friend, how are you? Because a lot has happened since our last pod. A lot has gone down in the Norwich City sphere. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm fairly well, thank you. I think, as you say, a lot has taken place in the 3 weeks since we last spoke, roughly. Even though we've only had 2 games taking place with Webber leaving and Knapper coming in, I'm pretty sure when we last recorded we didn't know Webber was going to be heading off, did we? But it all escalated at the Blackburn game. I think he made the right call by heading out as he did, and I'm sure we're going to come on to talk about that. But yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm ready to see how the men get on once again this coming weekend, as well as the women's team as well. Big game coming up for them at the weekend. So yeah, a double both in Norwich. Looking forward to it and looking forward to this.
It is a crazy time at Norwich City at the moment. You rightly touched on there. The women are having a fantastic season. And for those who haven't been to go and see a game, make sure you get down to the Nest or wherever they're playing. It well worth a watch and considerably better in terms of the level of viewing compared to the men's team at the moment. But it's the men's team we'll talk about. And I want to roll my eyes, but it's a choice for us to do this, so I shan't do that. Let's touch on Stuart Webber first. I did sort of contemplate this idea of doing a podcast where we go over Stuart Webber, the good, the bad, the David Brent. But I think there's enough content out there by the time I realised that, maybe we shouldn't. There's some great content out there, but we will touch on it now before moving on to Ben Knapper and the state Norwich City could find themselves in, the state we want them to find themselves in, and the state that we realistically think they could find themselves in. But as I said, we'll start with Stuart Webber. George, this word legacy was used throughout his Norwich City tenure. Of course, he's no longer employed by Norwich City. It's now Ben Knapper. This word legacy was used, and he always painted this picture of, I want to leave Norwich City with a legacy in place. And this legacy that he has left behind him, because my goodness, it's a legacy, all right. What do you make of that in terms of that broad question? Because, of course, we'll go into the finer details, but when you think of Stuart Webber as a man who has just left our football club and the 6 years he spent here, how do you sort of reflect on that?
I think for definite, it's a mixed bag is how I would first of all describe it. It feels as if, having read through it wasn't a statement, was it? It was a message as he departed. I feel like he mentioned a lot of times in there the training ground, and a lot of it often comes back to the training ground. And I think, yeah, fair enough. It's great that we've got a training ground there that attracts players and that they come and see it and they think, wow. But I think really, 90% or more than 90% of Norwich fans are never going to see inside that training ground. So it kind of frustrates me a little bit that it always comes back to that. In terms of the general legacy, I said they're a mixed bag. We're always going to remember the high points, going back to Villa Park the day we won the title. The first title under Farker, but my memory of that day, I will always remember the fact that Webber was down there on the pitch and he was part of that, and everyone at that time was singing his praises. I think in terms of the negative side of it, I mean, I've written down here, because you kind of teed up that we were going to be discussing it. I think the first big mistake that he made isn't so much the signings that were made in that second Premier League season, because I think when the signings were made, I can remember at the end of that August summer transfer window, there were graphics being posted everywhere, and just generally Norwich fans saying, look at all these signings we've made. what a window it's been. And okay, so many of those went wrong, but I think where he went really wrong was not really having any plan in place when he got rid of Daniel Farker. I personally think it was the right decision to get rid of him, but the fact that we then saw Dean Smith come in the following week, even though Smith had been in a job the night Farker was sacked, that was immediately the signal that there wasn't a plan for when Farker went. And it always felt like up until that point, everything that Norwich were doing had some sort of plan behind it. Of course, there's going to be a mix of that. You're going to have to work, act with your feet kind of thing, and, work quickly in the job that he's in. But it felt like, to me, up until that point, and of course, it's easy in hindsight because we're looking back on this in general, but I feel like that was kind of the key point, and kind of since then, we haven't really had anything overridingly positive to discuss. But yeah, it's a mixed bag in answer to your question. That's kind of how I see it in terms of when it changed from positive to negative.
I find it a tricky one with Stuart Webber, but I think you've defined it well there in terms of this idea that you can almost see that little bookmark, can't you, of where things started to turn before the sacking of Daniel Farke. You're absolutely spot on. Everything felt really sort of planned and organised, and there is a narrative that has been pushed slightly by certain journalists, which is, well, all the second half, we'll call it, of his Norwich City tenure was things bubbling, over, that had been bubbling away for a certain while. For me, as fans who don't see the inner workings, nor particularly care to see the inner workings, I don't think that's the narrative we should push. So I'm going to try and stay away from that. But it's very clear that change that happened, and everything, as you said, basically fell apart, didn't it? Norwich became very reactive to situations and really poorly. And I'd completely forgotten. I know Dean Smith was not long out of a job, but I'd completely forgotten that on the night of Farker sacking, he was still in a job, which at the time felt bizarre. But as we always try to do as football fans, as is our job to, you try and put that positive spin on it of, well, his mind is still in the game. He's not been on holiday and he's got loads of experience and blah, 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 all of that. All of these sort of, in retrospect, excuses you make for what was, I don't think, a very good appointment. Same for David Wagner. We could talk about that for days. But the thing with Stuart Webber is it's easy to sort of pick out the training ground. We'll never see that. And I completely agree. But Norwich City, from my perspective, are in a better place than where they were when he picked us up. But I don't think we're in that much of a better place in the sense of what was the squad and the club that he inherited from the previous folk, we shall say. It was an aging squad, a rapidly aging squad, some really silly contracts sort of just floating around Carrow Road in terms of playing personnel. It was a team without a style, without a purpose, really. A team that felt very entitled to be in the Premier League without any real reason. And this is being used as a stick to beat Stuart Webber with, which I'm going to continue to do so because I think is a very fair point. But you look at the squad now and it's quite old. It feels very entitled to be in the Premier League, especially with the signings they made. It absolutely stinks of we can walk it with these experienced players. And some not so sensible contracts. You look at players like Shane Duffy who have been given more than a year, and it's like it really backs up this point of everything was thrown out of the window, which Connor makes this point quite often about Stuart Webber, which is he was good at sort of dragging the club from A to B, but then when he got to B, he then just sort of went back to A, and it's a bit like you can go backwards and forwards. And if Stuart Webber had left Norwich City at the time that he foreshadowed at the beginning of his tenure, which was, I'll do 3 years, then be gone, and he maintained that message for a while, didn't he? I don't really know at what point the narrative changed, but he ended up being here for over 6 years. It's a bit like, if you'd left after 3, mate, I think you'd have been viewed as to be hyperbolic, but God in a way, in the sense if you came to this football club, you changed the culture, you improved the facilities, and you could have gone on to better things. I believe this idea that he had Premier League offers in terms of bigger clubs, but you didn't. And I keep hearing this quote misquoted, which is you live long enough. No, what was it? The beautiful irony of that being you live long enough to see yourself become the hero or become the villain. I don't know. The irony of me saying misquoted and then misquoting it myself is truly beautiful. But like, it's absolutely spot on. And in that period, you sprinkle in a lot of personality. My thing in terms of consistency with Stuart Webber is that it always felt very honest. It felt like him. It never felt like a front. This PR that he had, this personality, but there was a lot of unnecessary things sort of thrown in there, and it's a bit like, oh, come on, mate, you didn't need to talk about what was it? He said like divorcees in the snake pit. It's a bit
Yeah.
like, okay, you're talking to a minority of the fans, but like I'm not a divorcee in the snake pit. I'm looking at that comment going, that's just unnecessarily harsh. And if you are sitting in the snake pit, you're probably thinking, this guy is an absolute idiot. And it's things like that which chipped away over time in terms of that relationship between him and the fans. And ultimately, in my opinion, led to the fact that he didn't feel the urge or didn't feel like he could. I don't know. I'm not inside of his brain. But to go over and show some, I don't know, anything to the away fans when he got that guard of honour against Cardiff, that really sums it up for me. And it's such a fascinating period of Norwich City's history, and it's nice that there are those positive moments, there are those memories, and thank you very much for those. But I've never felt more ready to move on. I remember 3 years ago being like, oh my god, I hope he never leaves. Now we're like, thank God he's gone. That really does, and I feel like that only, this thing would only happen at Norwich City, which is it's just mental. The last thing, George, I want to speak about when it comes to Stuart Webber is, what is your opinion on him not going over and doing anything to the fans? Do you think it's sad in the sense of, oh well, he had chance previously of we want Webber out, that kind of stuff, or do you think it's very much a case of, well, Stu, mate, you made your bed and you had to lay in it? What's your take on it?
I mean, I wasn't there in the away end, so I can't say how it must have felt, because when I've seen clips back of it, I kind of think, what must this be looking like from the away end if they've just celebrated it, with the players? If you see that across from the stadium, they could probably make out that it was Stuart Webber, but they were probably wondering, is he coming over here? I don't blame Webber for keeping his distance, because, like you said there, the way it turned at Blackburn was not pleasant, and I don't envy him that. I think I could see why it boiled over like it did. Is it sad that that it ended like that? It probably is, because it did. There was a time that what did we have? There were T-shirts being made with his face on it, weren't there? But that is kind of just the way these things work, isn't it? But yeah, I don't feel any particular sadness. I'm with you in that um, it feels refreshing to have someone else at the top who is making the calls. And it's interesting what you said about the comments he made in certain interviews, which always felt crazy, because he was never prompted to talk about the things that got in the headlines, like you mentioned the snake bit divorcees. Not to keep referring back to the women's team, but the comment he made about the standard of the women's team, or the women's game, whatever he said, he was quite simply asked about, I think the question was, how pleasing is that for the club to have that kind of thing taking place, and suddenly he goes off in that direction. So I think he didn't help himself in that regard, but obviously the overall last couple of years with results deteriorating, and like you mentioned there, the aging squad, etc. It's all kind of come together to result in that ending. So no, I don't feel too much sadness about it.
I feel it my duty to also mention we aren't going to talk about the mountain climbing. That is of no interest to us. We know it's a hot topic at the best of times, but nope, not for us. Thank you very much. I think one big thing, and to finish on Stuart Webber, like I've said 3 or 4 times, is that attitude he took was, I think, at the best of times, almost felt brave in the sense of, oh wow, look how humble this guy is. But as things went wrong, continued to go wrong, it then very quickly became arrogance and it became disrespectful, and it didn't maintain that same value that it had when Norwich were being successful by our own definition. And yeah, it's a really bizarre one, and Ben Knapper will be fully aware of what Stuart Webber is like, because, you know, unless he's like got the same due diligence level of the current Norwich City lot, he would have done his research. He would have looked at his persona and what he said, because he'll be fully aware the questions that Stuart Webber was being asked will now be asked of him. And because it's not Stuart Webber, people will expect a different answer in terms of the actual answer, a different answer in terms of tone, and different like future projections, all those things. And Ben Knapper will be, well, he is essentially mopping up what Stuart Webber has left behind, which is such a fascinating thing. And the quote is, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." I can't believe that I fluffed that. That was
It's come
just
to you though.
insane.
That's
It
the main
has, yeah.
thing.
And I thought, it just in case we get a comment where I've given it the Billy, I've given it the Bertie. I thought, yeah, okay, right, we'll get that right. But like all Norwich City fans should do, we'll look forward, and I do wish it was very much the same case as when Stuart Webber came in, which is almost basically you're in May and you've got a summer to get things in place. I wish it was that, because the tone of our conversation could have been a lot lighter, but we are quite deep into a season now. For a season, for me, that has felt like it's just flown by really quickly. But Ben Knapper comes in with a different outlook, a great CV, by the way, from the research I've done and the comments you guys made, you and Connor made on the last podcast. But we are quite deep into a season. We're being led by a manager who, unless your opinion has changed, George, we don't want in the football club for whatever reason, which we'll talk about now. But looking forward, how do you do it? How do you try and pluck out the positives but keep your feet on the ground? Do you, I don't know, put your blinkers on and go, we can't look behind us? Well, in my opinion, it's a bit of both. But as a fan, George, your outlook at the moment, how do you try and perceive things?
Um, I think first of all on Napa, I mean, I think a lot of Norwich City fans with any interest, or every Norwich City fan with any interest, would have watched the initial video we've had with him on the club channels. I'm personally disappointed at this point that he still hasn't been put in front of Connor and his um, local media colleagues, only because there's only so much you can get from a club interview, and in reality, I don't feel like we really got anything from that first one. I know he touched on the football he expects his coaches to play, and that kind of thing, but I think until he's actually asked questions that he hasn't been briefed on previously, we won't really get to see um, more about him. I'm not saying I want him to be grilled, because he's clearly not in the position where he needs to be grilled, because he's only settling in. But yeah, I'm quite disappointed that hasn't happened yet. In terms of the task he's got at hand, I would like to think this first week and a half or so, he spent a lot of time with the likes of Neil Adams and the staff who have been there for that period of time. Because even though Neil Adams sat on the stage at Great Yarmouth and, you know, defended Wagner and said, I think he said a quote, correct me if I'm wrong, he said something like, maybe we're going to change things on the outside now, didn't he, rather than the head coach, which is a quote that has angered a lot of people. But at the same time, um, they must have been having those discussions in relation to Wagner. I actually think the Adams was quite fortunate that he went into that Q&A off the back of a win, because if they'd gone into that off the back of another negative result, the questions could have been even more difficult than they actually were. So I think that's surely got to be the key for Knapper, if he really has been on the outside, which clearly he has. He's been taking some time off. I think the question now is he's going to give Wagner time, but how many games does he get? Is this an audition for Wagner? Is it will he be told you've got until January? Because realistically, these next 6 weeks up until the Christmas period, you can reignite your season, or you can lose it. It can be pretty much over by the new year. We've still got 30 games to play, but we're going to go through a lot of games within this next period. So if he's going to go with Wagner throughout that, that's a big risk given the form we've been in. I don't know if I've answered your question there, but that's just a few of my thoughts in terms of what Adams has had to sit through, and I'm just interested to know how that partnership is going to work. But they've got a previous relationship, haven't they? So maybe that'll help.
The difficult thing at the moment is Norwich are in a position where they need to set a narrative, whether it's tweaking the current one, whether it's starting again. A narrative needs to be set, and I don't know. I find it difficult because, as you said, there is an outpouring of support for David Wagner, and it's a bit like, oh my god, we have all this background information of what we've seen towards the end of, well, I mean, for half of last season, as well as this season, and it's a bit like, hang on a minute, it's not like Wagner's been here since the beginning of the season and he's not been given some great players and this, that, and the other thing, but it's like, what are we actually doing? Because you've got 27, well, it's definitely not 27,000 people, but you've got a lot of people who can look at this football team and can diagnose. You've got one of three things. You've got the players and the manager aren't good enough, or you've got the players not being good enough and a manager who is underprepared, or you've got a manager who isn't good enough and players who are underprepared. And my answer is, well, it's a bit of both. But the way they seem to be remedying that situation and the situation, I should say, is that we're sticking with Wagner. We're going to give him all this time in the world. And they've really pushed that. I honestly don't think I've ever seen, maybe apart from Daniel Farke's first season, but this level of support where David Wagner has sat there after the level of performances we've seen over the nearly, I don't know if it has been a year or not since he's been in charge, but no, it hasn't been, is it? Was it Boxing Day, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was early January, so we're 10 months in now.
So we're approaching a year. We're getting real close to a year of stuff that isn't very good to watch and isn't very promising. But we've got David Wagner in a press conference going, yeah, but I've got a phone call from Delia and Michael saying, you have our full support. And we're all sat there like, what's happening? And I'm getting really, I don't know, I don't think this is like particularly used as like a reason to keep Wagner, but I'm getting really bored of people talking about what a nice bloke he is. Because he seems like a nice bloke, cool. But, and then he doesn't deserve any malicious chance. But it's very rare that a football manager, as a human being, deserves that kind of chanting. But he is nowhere near good enough at what he does. And we've seen that, from my perspective, as someone who isn't particularly analytical to the level of, and I'll always reference him, NCFC analysis, where he has sat there and picked apart the flaws in his plan. And it's like, come on, guys, you've got people like me, you've got people like him. We're all Norwich City fans. We can all see this isn't working, but we seem to keep being behind it. And this win against Cardiff was such a, I don't think anyone was at all convinced. It's the first time Norwich City have won a game. And it's like no one is convinced at all. We've all sort of been a bit like, well, yeah, we were all right, but let's not ignore the last 10, 11 months of what's been going on. And the fact that Norwich City find themselves in this state where the guy who's been basically running the football club for the last 6 years doesn't even come over and acknowledge fans who haven't just made an away trip, but an away trip to Cardiff. And it's just like, what is going on?
I think something you said there almost unintentionally, but it kind of sums it up, and it's worrying that this hasn't been recognised enough clearly by the board and those at the top. But you said 27,000 people, and then you remembered, oh no, there's nowhere near 27,000 people. I mean, I was at I was there for the first half an hour of the Blackburn game before I headed off for the Nest, and you looked around that ground and the number of empty seats. I don't actually know the attendance that was written there, but people are now voting with their feet at Carrow Road as well as away from home, and yeah, that isn't something that we've become accustomed to at all. And they must be including season tickets in the capacity, which is something I know Arsenal have done in previous years as well. But they're surely opening their eyes and seeing that, because Delia and Michael must have been at most, if not all, of the home games. You can't ignore that. The seats are yellow. You can't miss them. They are there, and until something more drastic changes, I think that's going to be the same. I think it'll be the same at QPR on Saturday. Okay, Webber's gone, but still, people are looking at the product they're getting and they're thinking that let's go and do something else with our Saturday afternoons. I just think the attendances it's surely a big worry, because for so many years there's been talk in the background about building onto the City stand, getting a bigger capacity. We're a million miles off that right now. Sure, it can change quickly, but what is going on with that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's more almost the metaphor behind that, in the sense of I was there, admittedly, I was very young and I don't really remember it that much because I walked into a lamppost before that game, but I was there when Norwich lost to Colchester. Sincerely wish I walked into that lamppost
I feel
after the game.
fortunate I wasn't there, actually. I was on holiday and I was told at half time it was 5-0, and I said, no, it isn't, and went inside. But no, it really is 5-0.
Yeah, well, imagine being there, George. That's all I got to say. Goodness me, that
Did
I
you
think
last
that's
till
a
the
lot
end?
Yeah, I've never left a game early. That's a blessing and a curse. Me and my dad just at this point, I'll just go on a random tangent. At this point, Norwich City season ticket to me is just a bit of bonding time with my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that day because I think by sort of 4. Well, by any time Michael Theocritos went to catch the ball, we were just laughing and having fun.
His only
Obviously, what
appearance,
followed was
wasn't it?
fantastic. His only appearance, and I heard a story that before the game, when they were how before the game they sign stuff and take photos. Apparently, he was shaking like a leaf and was just very nervous, which was really reflected in his performance.
I bet.
But back to the point, which was the extension of the stadium. It's not something we'll get into because it's all very political, and I don't care to speak of something where there isn't really concrete facts. But in my brain, I was always thinking, well, Norwich would fill that no issue, because Norwich City are always selling out season tickets. I know loads of people who have been waiting for a season ticket for ages, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, wow, now's your chance. But it's I'm actually at a point now where you get to Carrow Road on a match day, and it's well, hang on a minute, this isn't as full as what it used to be. And not to blow things too out of proportion, it's not like Leeds when they weren't in the Premier League, where they could barely fill half the stadium. It's very noticeable, and I think complacency has always been a thing there, where Norwich and the board, and to an extent, I don't think it'll ever get too bad, but you just expect the fans to show up, and it's a bit okay, cool, yeah. But it's very noticeable on a match day, and the Blackburn game, you notice how many people left, and that word apathy was such a key one. After that first goal went in, we were all like, all right. The second one, when there was a bit of outrage, because there was that, when that first one went in, that the rage began to sort of boil. It's like someone flipped on the kettle, and as the second goal scored, it was at the screaming point where everyone was like, oh my God, here we go again. But complacency is such an issue, and has been an issue, and I think that's one of the narratives that has been pushed in terms of an executive level at Norwich City. And what was my other point? I can't remember what my other point was now. I'm very sure it'll come back to me, but that was it. It was to do with Neil Adams and the thing you mentioned, which was this idea of looking around the edges, or around the sides or edges, whatever he said, before making that rash decision. And it's okay, it's great that you're doing that, and I get the idea that you're perhaps trying to nudge that narrative on a path of caution, and look, we're going to make sensible decisions again, informed decisions even. But it's oh man, that came at the expense of losing Daniel Farker. And by no means do I sit here and think, oh, I wish we'd never sacked Daniel Farker. It's just a bit like, it's such a big and tough lesson to learn. Why did it have to be at the expense of someone who is proving to be still a very good coach? So yeah, it's a tough one to be positive, isn't it, George? But like, I keep saying "but like" a lot. I think, do you know what? That happens when I go on a rant, and it's difficult to not rant about Norwich at the moment. And I did set the task for us to sprinkle in some positivity, so we'll try and do that before we call time. Any thoughts on that at all, George? I see you. I see you go to speak sometimes, and I just feel awful because I'm like, I got to get it all out because that's the way, you got to get it all off your chest, haven't you?
No, you have. I just think it's interesting on attendances because I've always kind of said or had a go at my Ipswich mates for how rubbish theirs have been in recent years, and you mentioned there how we'll always sell out, and I've never really thought that it's going to be that it would go the way it has, but yeah, it seems to have flipped so quickly. Like I say, I'm not saying it is over this season because we've got 30 games to go and football can change quickly. And if we're talking about positives, I couldn't believe, or I suppose I was surprised when I looked after the Cardiff game. Ipswich have got the best attacking record in the league, and then underneath that, Norwich City are joint with Leicester, the second best attacking record in the league after 16 games. So, you know, we don't need to go over how poor we are defensively. We don't really need to be we don't need to be brilliant defensively. We just need to cut out the goals we're conceding every game, and we could be a quite capable team. So I don't know how far off we actually are, but while you're shipping 2, 3, in the last 4 games we've conceded 10 goals. While you're conceding at that rate, you can't pick out the positives because conceding goals at that rate is just not sustainable. But that's what I mean. If we could sort that out, we could be onto something, particularly with Barnes coming back from injury, etc. This is me attempting to try and steer us towards positivity. I know we want to mention George Long possibly in a bit as well, but yeah, we're not miles off. It does feel a bit like it, but maybe something can turn soon. I hope it does.
Yeah, I think for those who are listening or watching it have gone, well, I don't want to talk about George Long. Give us a minute and we'll get there and you'll understand. Because we spoke about it pre-pod, didn't we? We were a bit like, oh man, we've got to mention George Long, which it's just, well, it's not funny, but it is actually quite funny at the same time. But what encapsulates for me this narrative with Norwich at the moment is that we are a Norwich City podcast. We talk about all things Norwich City, but we aren't fussed to talk about a win. We almost look at it as like oh yeah, but that doesn't matter. And to be in a position where when you're talking about your football club that you can just ignore a win. Obviously, we haven't completely ignored it, but it's mental. It's mental that Norwich City find themselves in a position where people like me and you could look at a win as, oh yeah, but it doesn't really mean much, does it? And you're absolutely right. And let's get into the positivity before we cap it off with talking about George Long. But let's try and be a bit more positive. I think you're absolutely spot on. I don't think the football at the beginning of the season was a fluke by any means. There's evidence that Norwich City can create some good football. And none of the goals really have been a fluke or particularly undeserved. On the front foot, when they want to be, this Norwich City squad, whatever you think of them, are really capable and can produce and yield some really aesthetically pleasing results. And obviously we saw that at the beginning of the season. And despite shipping all of these goals, we can still score. And as you said, if we can cut out the silly errors, if we can do this, if we can do that, we're now at a point with the manager where that is if we get someone different. Because there is that debate of, well, you've still got the same squad of players, but evidence suggests that squad of players are massively underachieving. And you're absolutely right. The squad will stay the same, but with a different manager, you can get a little bit more out. But also with a different manager, at any point of this season, you're preparing for next season. And again, let's keep the blinkers on and look at this season and not look too far forward. But this season can still be a success for Norwich. It's up to us to redefine as fans. It's up to them as a football club to redefine and almost not rip up the previous narrative, but set this new narrative of what success means to us. For me, it's to begin playing a defined style of football that fans believe in, but also that players believe in, with the promise that recruitment will be structured around supporting that, because that's what we had, wasn't it, with Daniel Farker, where Ben Knapper's job is not easier, but where he will have that inspiration is what Stuart Webber did when he got here, which was he brought in a manager with a defined style, and it was not just that; it was a style that could have and should have been sustainable. A manager, personality is not the most important thing, but a manager who clearly wanted to be here, wasn't Dean Smith on the rebound, isn't David Wagner, who's trying to save his own career, because let's not forget what roads have led him to Norwich City. But that element of personality will be important, as well as this promise of we're going to develop players, we're going to sign young players, we're going to look afar. Obviously, back then it was the second tier of German football, and we're all well aware and very familiar with this Brexit implication of, well, second tiers in Europe aren't the most viable now. But there is a remedy there of South America, and we've seen Gabi Sara, we've seen what, to a degree, Nunez can do. So it's a bit like, well, hang on a minute. I said this on the last pod. The blueprint is there. It's just about how you achieve that. And this is information I got from Connor, via that podcast, which is Ben Knapper as an individual is more data orientated. Stuart Webber wasn't. And that's a fresh outlook. That's a fresh input that this football club needs. From what I've gathered from, much like to anyone listening to this, Norwich's approach is more so inspired by data and this business input that the Atanasios have had. And sure, okay, look, they've got a big checkbook, and for what it's worth, they aren't going to be signing an endless amount of blank checks. But it's like they have a very valuable input in terms of operational side of things, and this idea of, well, data is very important. But I can't remember what podcast it was now. I think it was Stuart Webber's interview with the Pinkin after last season, where he basically said, data-wise, these guys are fantastic, but facilities, they're nowhere near where we are. And great, facilities-wise, we're fantastic, but let's bring in that fresh input. I'm not just going to say data, even though it is that, but let's bring in that fresh input and things like that. The little rant I've been on there, things like that really make me feel a bit more like, okay, there's something for us to believe in. It's just, you do need to see it short term. And the fact that we're going to get to January and we aren't going to spend any money, we aren't going to sign any players, because we saw, and I can't believe we didn't mention it, we saw that whopping great loan repayment needed.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, okay, that's fine. But we can still see, based off what we have, signs of success. For example, right, George, don't know if you thought about this before, but imagine being Sam McCallum. So, okay, you're never playing because of Janulis anyway, sure. But when Janulis is out of form,
they throw Paqueta in.
Yeah, I'm a left-footed left-back who's quite athletic. I don't think he's technically very good, but as a second choice, meh. You are seeing, I mean, after that Cardiff game, one of the worst...
The second goal.
Mental, absolutely mental. You're seeing a footballer who isn't good enough in his own position, nowhere near good enough. Sorry, Shemi, if you're watching, Pepe, whatever they call him, but he is nowhere near good enough technically. He's quite quick, but as a winger, sorry, at the best of times is what I'm getting at. But as a left back, my goodness, absolutely woeful, and that decision rests on David Wagner, and it's a bit like, oh man, and the fact that we're sat here praying for Danny Bart, as I said in the last pod, I really didn't have that on my Norwich City bingo card for this season. But it's things like that undercut that bit of positivity. And George, before we move on to your fellow George, any input on that?
Yeah, it's interesting you mention McCallum. Since you've just referenced him there, I'm trying to think. He came in in a January window, didn't he? But I
That's
can't
right.
think. I can't think exactly which one it is. And then he was loaned back. But it feels like he's a player who's, you know, been at the club for a fair chunk of time now,
Yeah.
and we've still never really seen this promise that was supposed to be there. I think you could also talk about Jakob Sorensen in the same light. Um, admittedly, he's probably had a bit more game time while also having a bit of disruption this season with injury. But he's a player who's been at the club since 2021. So we're now talking. No, 2020 he came in because he was in the team for the second Varka promotion, and
Mhm.
he's never been someone you would class as a first choice starter. Again, maybe we're going. Maybe we could go back into Webber's recruitment on this. We're not going to do that, but I do think it's interesting that we have got those players who have never made that impact, but are still there as the squad players. We don't need to go into the loanees that have gone out, come back in, and are now back in the squad. But it comes back to the idea of the dross that is in the squad. Um, I think the starting 11 that we've got is really good, as it proved at the start of the season. I'm really worried about what Wagner is going to tell us about John Rowe on Thursday. Hopefully, it's, if he's going to miss a game, let it only be the QPR one and maybe Watford. Um, I mean, ideally, no games at all. But yeah, the depth isn't there, and I think you make a good point by raising McCallum, because there are a lot of those players.
Do you know what? Again, for me, it's a human level of this. Well, hang on a minute. You have got this professional footballer who it just is needlessly sitting on the bench, and it's almost a waste of resources. And by no means am I sat here thinking, oh, we can develop Sam McCallum into something Premier League worthy, which for me should be the goal for most, well, every single young signing that we make. And it's all right to get some wrong. Jakob Sorensen is an example for me of a signing that I'm okay with not particularly blossoming into anything, because we tried something. It's just that when you look at that first championship winning season where you had your Felix Paslak, who came into the club with a bit of expectation, but it turned into nothing. You then had Max Aarons behind him to take that place, and you had Emi Buendia coming in to replace Ben Marshall as a signing, because Ben Marshall was signed as a winger, wasn't he? And it's a bit like, over these past 3 years, before the Webber's first 3 years, you had this balance, didn't you, of terrible signings but great signings. That the volume was much greater on this side, but on this side you had Tim Krul, Timu Puki, Emi Buendia, so it balanced.
Who
And
performed so well that they were leveling out with the greater
exactly,
numbers. Yeah,
exactly, and for such little resource as well. And let's not pretend it's peanuts, because it's football, it's a lot of money. But also, things very quickly went whoop, just like that.
mm-hmm.
And for those listening, I'm performing the action of a scale, which I'm sure George will tell you was a wonderful motion there. But
Great
it's
sound
like,
effect. Need more of
thank you
those.
very much. I should do it professionally, but I tend not to. But it's like, how do we get to this position? And there's a lot of factors, isn't there, where people have said, well, Kieran Scott, again, chief scout at Norwich, was used as an example. Who was it? Greg Broughton or
Mm-hmm.
something. A lot of
Mark
his
Blackton,
players
yeah.
during his tenure at Norwich. What was his list? It was like Max Aarons, Jamal Lewis, Ben Godfrey, that lot,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. People are picking out these names and going, well, actually, Webber wasn't responsible. It was this guy, and it was this guy, and it was this guy. And it's a bit like, oh my God, this just complicates matters even more for people who, don't live and breathe Norwich City niche names as well. And it just adds an extra layer of, oh, Stuart Webber wasn't that great in the grand scheme of things. It's impossible to comment on with any sort of real, I don't know, you know what I mean?
But it is a shame, though, because in 5 years to come, because people will hold grudges against Webber, they'll be coming back to things like that, when really we should just try and shelve it and say, we had a couple of brilliant seasons, we also had a couple of disasters, and just try and move on. But that's kind of life. That's not just football. People are always going to go back to that stuff. yeah, we've covered a lot there, haven't we?
We have. It's an interesting one, as I keep saying, because I tell you what, for those listening, if you're wondering why I keep saying it's an interesting one, it's because I have to stop myself from saying something really reckless. I go, if I say it's an interesting one, then I can have an extra second to think about what I'm going to say. So that's all that is.
Talking about
But
reckless, what about George Long? Well,
talking about reckless,
there's a few words. Maybe reckless isn't quite right, but
what an
the
excellent
signing
segue.
the signing was reckless. I think
The signing was, yeah, it's a bit like it was for maybe not so much Shane Duffy, but like most of these free signings, it was a bit like, oh well, he's free, so it's very low risk, high reward. But George Long, like, I don't like that we're doing this, but also he's just not very good. He's just really bad. I don't feel safe. I mean, I don't feel safe at the best of times defensively, but this idea that when you had Angus Gunn, you could almost sit there and think, I trust the goalie to pull off a big save, and if he doesn't save it, then there'll be a valid reason. Which let's not paint a completely golden picture for Angus Gunn. He's made a couple of mistakes, but goalies do. With George Long, for you, George, are you sat there just like just get out of the way and let it go in? Just sort of do that.
it does feel a little bit like that. I think the reason I mentioned this to you before we started recording, just that I wanted to mention it, um, is because when a signing of a backup keeper is made, and it happened with this one, you read um, certain comments from Millwall supporters. I've actually got a Millwall supporting mate who I went to uni with, and I sent him a message saying, "What's he like?" And I think he said something like, "Oh, I'll drive him to Norwich myself if you want." That kind of off the cuff comment. But I think when you're signing a backup goalkeeper, you don't worry about it until Angus gets injured, do you? It's just because when it's signed, you think Angus Gunn has been at the club. Well, he had his first spell, and now he's had 2 years since re-signing. He's never really. Well, he might have had one injury when he'd come in for Krul, then went out, and then Krul came back in. But he doesn't strike you as someone who's likely to get injured, so you don't worry about it until it comes. Um, and don't get me wrong, Angus hadn't had a brilliant season. I think he had a shocker at Plymouth when everything that came at him went through him. That doesn't mean I was at any point saying we need to change it, but yeah, I just don't have any confidence in Long whatsoever. I had a look at some stats actually while we were waiting. So he came in at half time against Leeds. So I didn't find any, not half time, just before half time. I didn't find any split stats first half, second half against Leeds. But in the 4 games he started since Leeds, so Borough we conceded 8 shots on target, Sunderland we conceded 9, Blackburn 4, Cardiff 6. So that's 27 shots on target across the 4 games. We've conceded 10 goals in those 4 games. So for every 3 shots on target we've conceded a goal, which I don't know whether I thought it would be a worse ratio than that. But yeah, I don't have any confidence in him ultimately, and I really hope Gunny is back fairly soon or very soon, this Saturday ideally.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for us to perform a drive by like that on him, but
It is.
I think you're spot on. I think you're absolutely spot on, and you raised a good point, didn't you, about us playing Ipswich and this idea of there's just an extra layer of worry for that game. This idea that you haven't got a Tim Krul to bail you out with a massive save, like a massive penalty save. You haven't got him to bail you out. You haven't got Angus Gunn, who has done some harm, but has done far more good. A lot like Tim Krul, in my opinion. It had the odd howler. Plymouth is a great example for Gunn as a bad game, but for every bad game, he'll have 5, 6, 7, 8 very good games where he has saved us points. He's just not a particularly vocal goalkeeper, which is why he'll never play for he never played for England, and why he'll play for Scotland. Haha, very funny. But it's just there are so many layers. That East Anglian derby, especially, where it's like, oh my god, we're a bit.
And yeah, I don't think if Gunny's in for the derby, I don't think that means we suddenly go from losing it to winning it. I think we're in for a struggle, whatever. I just think
one less thing to worry about.
Yeah, I just think with Long in goal, it could get horribly ugly for us. Like I said, maybe I'm being harsh. I haven't seen all four of the games that he started in their entirety, but just I haven't seen him make enough saves, and there's been shots that have gone through him. The one I immediately think back to in my head is the third Leeds goal at Carrow Road when he didn't really dive for it. It just went past his left knee, and he just kind of stood there outstretched. Again, he might have dived for it and not got there, but there's still kind of things you expect
Was that
from your
the
keeper.
Somerville one?
Yeah, so he raced away
Yeah.
and with his right foot bent it in the bottom
Yeah.
right corner.
Yeah, well, the second goal as well. I don't know if you remember that. I think it's it's harsh to. Do you know what I keep saying? It's boggling my mind that like we're sat here picking out George Long, but again we're spot on with what we say. That second goal where it was drilled across and went basically through him to hit Duffy and go in. I remember when he came on, I turned to my dad and you're spot on with what you said about what Millwall fans said on social media. I turned to my dad and literally went, "Oh, Millwall fans didn't like this guy at all."
Yeah.
I think he played 37 games last season for them.
He was their number one, wasn't he? Yeah, but they really don't like him.
Yeah, it's not. It's just.
You're right though,
really...
because we could also pick on a lot of the defensive players and go through all of Gibson and Duffy's howlers. And maybe if Long was watching this, he'd say, "Yeah, go on, do that as well. Make me feel better." We're not going to do that. I just think it has been something that has contributed to the recent results that maybe hasn't been mentioned that much. Although I have seen people on social media mention it because it has been there for you to see.
It's almost a running joke now, isn't it? This idea of like, when is George Long going to make a save? And I think he's made a couple, but it is almost a running joke at this point. And hopefully it doesn't get too malicious, is what we'll say, but not great at all.
No.
In terms of looking forward then, George, Norwich City play, is it QPR next? QPR, a club from the outside in disarray. The whole Gareth Ainsworth tenure, again, from the outside, was watching it was fascinating because you had a guy who did a great job at Wickham, but for me, it was very quick, and we've seen it in football before, haven't we? Was very quickly exploited as not being anywhere near good enough for the level that he stepped up to. And
felt like
QPR
felt like Nathan Jones leaving
exactly
Luton, didn't it? Similar to that.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. Do you know what? I was in my brain. I was very quickly trying to think, who can I compare that to? And Nathan Jones is a fantastic example. But like, I don't know. Are we saying QPR are going to have a bounce? Like, not a new man. I don't know if they've. I think they have appointed someone, haven't they? Like
they drew
a Spanish guy.
They drew at Rotherham under the new guy, didn't they? 1-1, I think it was. Because Chair.
Are we saying they're going to have a bounce for Carrow Road, or are we saying, well, they're not very good, so we should win, or are we just saying, well, Norwich are crap, so we don't care? What's the angle?
I think it's a tricky one to call. I would if Norwich hadn't been on the run prior to Cardiff that we've been on, you would immediately be looking at that as a home win, wouldn't you? But yeah, it's hard to say. I think QPR have... Chair is probably the main player, and Lyndon Dykes, I think, while quality-wise, he hasn't got a lot of it. He is a handful just because he's a presence, and he chucks himself about, and against a really uncomfortable defence, he could have some joy. I'm really not sure. We'll see. We'll see in terms of John Rowe how we get on with him. But with the goals that QPR have conceded at will, and thinking positively again about our attacking record, maybe it's a case of we concede a couple, but dare I say it, score 3. I don't know. That's me looking at it with a positive outlook. But I certainly wouldn't be putting much money on us to win based on recent results.
So, and I think this will help shape the not so distant future. It will help shape our content to a degree, in the sense of, how are you now going to look at Norwich City? So, for example, say we do this again in 2 weeks' time, and Norwich have put in a Cardiff performance and won 3-2 again. Are we? I don't know. Will your mind? And again, we're speaking before the event, but are you going to sort of look to go back to, especially with the stuff happening behind the scenes and Ben Knapper, etc.? Are we going to go back to focusing fully on performances and David Wagner, or is it always going to be in the back of your mind that, yeah, he's going to go, it's just about when you pull the trigger? Does he almost have, because you mentioned the word audition earlier, didn't you, in terms of, is this now an audition for David Wagner, for Ben Knapper, which I think it is. How do you view looking at the next few weeks? Is it like, what are you going to be looking for, really?
Well, you mentioned the audition there. I think it's also kind of not so much an audition, but it's Napper's chance to, um, present himself to the fans. Okay, we've seen an interview, but we're going to need to hear more from him and his decision making. You mentioned about, you know, he mentioned about his playing style, and I think he said possession with high intensity, didn't he? And we know that Wagner, maybe possession isn't as high on his priority list as it would have been for Daniel Farker. So it's about Knapper deciding about that as well. I'm sure he will have names in mind, because if we lose at Carrow Road again on Saturday, um, everyone knows how many poor results QPR have had. So if they were to come and turn us over, we're back to square one, aren't we? I don't see a situation where Norwich beat QPR, then beat Watford, then beat Bristol City. I don't know how many of those games we're going to win, but I'm not sure I see it changing back to people giving Wagner more of a chance, just because the evidence hasn't been there defensively, that things are going to improve that drastically. Maybe it will with the likes of Barnes coming back in, maybe Angus Gunn. I'm not sure. But they're not the most difficult fixtures coming up, are they? But yeah, I'm not expecting a huge turnaround in results.
With this idea that David Wagner has the full support of the board and everyone at Norwich, I think with one last sort of scrape at the barrel, his his final hand is very much Barnes, Sargent, and maybe Gunn. I don't really know what his take on that whole situation is. He's probably like us and just thinking, oh God, can we have Angus Gunn back nice and soon? But his final hand will be Sargent and Barnes. And, maybe like John Rowe perking up a bit more and that kind of stuff. But, he's still playing and is injured, so we'll ignore that for now. But that really is it. Because in that fine spell of form, when Norwich were fun to watch, playing positive football, getting good results, scoring lots of goals, you had Josh Sargent and Ashley Barnes as a pivotal part of that. And it's a bit like, as you say, David Wagner's attention isn't on how can we retain the ball and create chances. It's how can we get the ball from here to there as quickly as possible. Obviously, when you, like Daniel Farker did eventually, it's more so in his first season, when you nail the how can we do it whilst on the ball, you get from here to there very quickly anyway. But from the get-go, where Norwich are way less afraid than what they used to be to just hoof it forward, where you were aiming for Sargent and Barnes, you're now aiming for whoever's up front that day, which, is most likely to be Adamida. He, as you mentioned to me before the pod, I didn't actually see, but he scored tonight. And I mean, we can do a whole podcast on Adamida alone, which I'm sure at one point we probably will, because he's such a fascinating case study at Norwich City. But, that was my I don't even know if that was positive there or not, but that's where I'm at in terms of, I think you're absolutely spot on. We need to see some more from Knapper. His interview was everything you'd expect from a club one, as you said, George. And
Yeah,
when he
nothing
gets
nothing
put,
unique in there whatsoever, was there? Which
no,
we,
no,
we
well,
shouldn't have
it's
expected it,
okay.
but
No, exactly, and it's okay because the guy is, like Stuart Webber was, and he's in a much more difficult position than Stuart Webber from a PR perspective, because Webber was in a new role at the club in a circumstance where everyone was like, oh my God, we need massive reform and change. Knapper is coming in where everyone is well informed of the sporting director role, however unique it is to Norwich. Because, I mean, for Stuart Webber, it was here, have the keys, mate, do what you want. But he's in the position with expectation. And it's like how, when Norwich started to go wrong was when the expectation came. Knapper is here with expectation. He's here with a very old squad. He's here with not 3 months to think about releasing players and getting his own. His circumstances, again, circumstances being the key word, for me, are way more difficult from a PR perspective than Stuart Webber. But we do need to see him, because, I don't want him to say something like, I don't know, we want to be top 17, that kind of stuff. I'm not after that. I'm just after the here and now of, I know results need to improve. My ideal manager would, and he can say it's David Wagner, cool, whatever, but I want to hear what it is. And then eventually, when he does get chopped, we'll deal with that when it comes to it. We'll do a Norwich City and we'll kick the can down the road before we get into that, because we could go for another hour on that. But it shall be, it shall pique my interest to a very high degree. George, I'm happy to call it there. Are you happy to call it there? Because I don't know how we've kept it under an hour, but we've covered quite a lot. Again, I'd like to say a big thank you to those who listened, to those who watched. If you want to rate the podcast, whether you're watching or listening, please do. It'd be much appreciated. If you don't, fair enough. Subscribe to on YouTube if you fancy it. Again, thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far. When you'll next see us in this format, I don't know. I'm hoping we can do some live stuff soon. I'm sort of figuring out the logistics of doing that, because, I mean, that's my bread and butter. I absolutely love doing live stuff, especially where we have a lot more emotion, or high level emotions running through our veins, especially after a result. But that's what's to come. Hopefully what's to come for Norwich City on the pitch is much better. And from myself and George, we'll see you again very, very soon.